World War II was nearing its end. Europe lay in ruins. Hitler was dead. Germany had capitulated. On the other side of the planet remained the last and most stubborn force, Japan. It still held armies on dozens of islands, and its soldiers fought to the last bullet. Every meter of land in the Pacific cost the Americans blood. For every patch of sand, every reef, every airfield, there were battles that devoured thousands of lives. The American command understood. If they had to storm the Japanese islands themselves, the losses would be monstrous. Operation Downfall was planned, an invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, which could cost more than 1 million human lives. Therefore, at that moment, in deep secrecy, another project was underway: the creation of a weapon capable of ending the war with a single strike. It was the atomic bomb, developed within the framework of the Manhattan Project. When the first prototypes were ready, they had to be delivered to the island of Tinian, where a base of heavy B-29 bombers was located. From there, the plane was to fly to Japan. But the delivery of the components required maximum speed and secrecy. For this purpose, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was chosen, a ship that was considered a symbol of reliability and luck. It had gone through almost the entire war, taking part in the battles for Guam, Iwo Jima, Tinian, and Okinawa. The crew knew it as the lucky ship. It had been attacked many times, yet it always returned. The ship's captain, Charles Butler McVeigh III, served with complete dedication. He was a strict but fair commander, and the sailors respected him. On July 1st, 1945, McVeigh received a strange order. He was instructed to proceed immediately to the California port of Hunters Point, take on a special cargo, and deliver it to the island of Tinian. No details were given. The order was top secret. Even he, the ship's captain, had no right to know what exactly was inside the container that would soon be loaded aboard. A few days later, a massive metal box was delivered to the pier. It was sealed and guarded by 2 armed officers. The container was placed in the hold and surrounded by sentry posts. No one was allowed to approach it, take photographs, or record in the log what exactly had been loaded. Only years later would it become known that inside were the components of the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, the same one that 3 weeks later would destroy Hiroshima. On July 16, 1945, the cruiser put to sea. Symbolically, on that very day, the first nuclear explosion in history took place in the New Mexico desert, the Trinity test. The world entered a new era, although no one on board the ship knew it. The vessel sailed without escort, at maximum speed and under complete radio silence. The route was kept in the strictest secrecy. Even in the headquarters, they knew only the destination, not the arrival dates. The passage went perfectly. Indianapolis moved through calm seas. The weather was favorable. Officers joked that it was the most boring voyage of the whole war. On July 26th, the ship arrived at Tinian. The cargo was unloaded and immediately handed over to the military engineers. The mission was accomplished 100%, without a single delay and without loss. Captain McVeigh received thanks from the command and a new order. Proceed to the island of Leyte, Philippines, where the ship was to take part in preparations for a possible invasion of the Japanese home islands. The route seemed safe. The Japanese fleet had been defeated. Submarines in that region were almost gone. The command decided the ship did not need an escort. It would save time and resources. No one imagined this decision would be fatal. On July 29, 1945, the night was quiet, the moon hidden behind clouds, the sea smooth and calm. The cruiser held a straight course at about 17 knots. At the same time, in these same waters, was the Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Captain Mototsuru Hashimoto. The submarine had been patrolling the area for several days in search of targets. When the Japanese detected the silhouette of a large ship, they realized that in front of them was prey of enormous scale. Around midnight, Hashimoto calculated the trajectory and gave the command to fire. 6 torpedoes left the tubes. After a minute, the first one struck the bow of Indianapolis. The explosion was enormous. The metal was torn apart. The men in the forward compartments died instantly. The second torpedo hit closer to the middle of the hull, pierced the fuel tanks, and caused a fire. Flames and smoke instantly engulfed the decks. The electricity failed. The radio went silent. The men did not have time to understand what had happened. Within a few minutes, Captain McVeigh ordered the ship abandoned. But there was almost no time. The vessel listed and began to sink. The fire spread with terrifying speed. The ammunition started to detonate. People were thrown into the water by the blast wave. 12 minutes after the torpedo struck, Indianapolis had completely gone under. About 300 men died immediately from the explosion and the collapsing structures. The remaining 900 found themselves in the open sea in the middle of the night. There had been no time to lower lifeboats. Most were left only with life jackets. The water was warm but saturated with fuel and oil. Men clung to each other, trying not to lose their comrades. Screams, splashes, chaos. Some tried to reach debris. Some prayed. Others were silent. No one knew what awaited them. The radio had not managed to send a distress signal, or it had been ignored. No one understood that a giant ship had vanished from the surface of the ocean. In headquarters, they had no idea that Indianapolis was gone. Soon the sea again became quiet. On the surface remained only wreckage, oil, and nearly 1,000 men slowly drifting in the dark. The first hours after the sinking were agonizing. Men held together in groups, called to each other by name, tried to count how many were still alive. Bodies of the dead and layers of burning fuel floated nearby. At dawn it became clear. There would be no help. The ocean was silent. And ahead awaited 4 days of hell. The first night after the death of Indianapolis passed in complete chaos. Men clung to everything that could float: boxes, pieces of wood, life jackets. On the surface drifted debris, fuel, and bodies. The oil spread over the water, forming a sticky film that burned the skin and eyes. The waves were gentle, but the salt water and heat made every minute unbearable. Captain McVeigh and several officers tried to organize the survivors, to gather them into groups so they would not get lost in the dark. But by dawn it was clear that most had been scattered over a vast area. The sea had stretched the men out for tens of kilometers. There was no communication. The radio had not managed to send the distress signal, and the few short messages that did get through were taken as false. No one on land knew the ship was gone. With the sunrise, the real torment began. The water seemed endless. The hot rays burned the skin, and around them there was not a single sign of land. People began to suffer from thirst. Those who could not endure it made a fatal mistake. They tried to drink seawater. Within a few hours after that came hallucinations, madness, and death. Thirst burned the mind. The salty liquid only accelerated dehydration. At first people stuck together and helped one another, but soon signs of despair began to appear. Some fell into panic. Others lost hope and simply let go, slipping beneath the water. By evening of the first day, the first sharks appeared. At first they circled at a distance, sensing the smell of blood. Then they began to come closer. At first there were no attacks. The predators cautiously investigated debris, shadows, and the movement of legs. But at night, when visibility disappeared, the real nightmare began. From the darkness came splashes and screams. Some called for their comrades, others cried out in pain. Then everything went silent again. Some tried to wave pieces of wreckage. Some beat the water to scare the sharks. It helped little. The predators returned again and again. By the morning of the second day, the sun rose over the boundless surface of the sea. For those who had survived, a new round of suffering began. The heat intensified. Many no longer had life jackets. They slipped off or tore apart. People tried to stay in groups of 10 to 15 so as not to lose sight of one another. The officers who still had a clear mind tried to maintain order. By noon, the sharks returned, first singly, then by the dozens. White tips, gray sharks, tiger sharks, the most dangerous in these waters. They did not always attack immediately. Often they simply circled for hours, checking who had weakened. As soon as someone lost strength and began to sink, the sharks attacked instantly. They did not devour everyone at once, but chose the weak and those bleeding. Panic grew. People screamed, lost self-control. Some, in madness, threw themselves into the water, convinced that there was a deck beneath them. Others tried to swim away, but the current brought them back together again. Those who remained alive tried not to move. Any sudden motion attracted the attention of sharks. By evening of the second day, the smell of death spread for many kilometers. The water around became viscous, saturated with blood and fuel. The sea that had once seemed calm was now filled with bodies, wreckage, and dorsal fins. In the sky, airplanes sometimes flew past, but they were too high to notice the survivors. Not one sent a signal. On the third day, many began to lose their minds. Dehydration, the sun, constant fear, and lack of sleep had done their work. People began to see mirages. Some claimed they saw shore, some heard voices. Some tried to swim toward a rescue ship that did not exist. Part of the survivors simply stopped resisting. They lowered their heads and sank silently. By this point, of the original 900, according to eyewitnesses, no more than 400 to 500 remained alive. The sharks did not leave. Sometimes they did not attack for an entire day, but returned at night when the survivors were weakest. Each new dawn brought fewer voices. Meanwhile, on land, the situation remained unchanged. At headquarters, it was believed that Indianapolis had already arrived at its destination. Because of secrecy, no one knew its exact route or the date of arrival. Therefore, even when the ship did not send a signal on schedule, no alarm was raised. For the Navy, it was normal that large vessels went without communication. No one understood that for 4 days in the ocean, hundreds of people were dying. Only on August 2nd did everything change by accident. An American pilot of a Ventura aircraft was performing a routine reconnaissance flight over the Philippine Sea. Suddenly he noticed a large oil slick on the surface. Thinking it might be a trace of a damaged ship, he descended and saw an incredible sight. Dozens of men in life jackets, chaotically drifting among debris. The pilot immediately transmitted the coordinates by radio. Within a few hours, a large-scale rescue operation began. Seaplanes took off for the site, and the nearest ships were directed there. One of the pilots, Lieutenant Wilbert Gwynn, took the risk. He landed his plane right on the waves to pick up at least a few people. His aircraft was damaged, but the crew managed to pull from the water dozens of half-dead sailors and tie them to the wings of the plane so they would not sink. When the rescue ships arrived, they found scattered people over a vast area, more than 150 kilometers long. As more rescuers came, the scale of the disaster became clear. Of 1,196 crew members, only 316 were alive. The remaining 880 had died in the water, from wounds, dehydration, the sun, or shark attacks. Many of the rescued were in a condition close to death. Their bodies were covered with burns, skin peeled, eyes inflamed, minds clouded. Some had to be treated for weeks, and some died already on the rescue ships. This tragedy became the largest catastrophe in the history of the U.S. Navy, not connected with battle. And the most terrible thing, it occurred literally 2 weeks before the end of the war. When the rescue ships delivered the last survivors to the base at Guam, news of the disaster became known to the entire U.S. fleet. For the Navy, it was a shock. Just 2 weeks before Japan's capitulation, the fleet had lost a large, heavy cruiser together with almost 1,000 men. And all this, not in battle, but practically into nowhere, without warning, without coordinates, without control. Immediately an investigation began. It was necessary to understand why no one noticed the disappearance of the ship, why the distress signal never reached, why the ship was even sailing without escort when Japanese submarines still operated in the Pacific. The answers were unpleasant. It turned out that no one had tracked the exact route of Indianapolis. Because of the secrecy of the mission, the documents with the schedule of movement had not been transferred to the regular headquarters. As a result, when the ship did not arrive at Leyte on schedule, this caused no alarm. The headquarters simply assumed it had been delayed. Moreover, the distress signal really had been received by several stations, but the duty officers considered it false. In the last weeks of the war, the command realized that someone had to be held responsible, and that man became the ship's captain, Charles Butler McVeigh III. He was an experienced officer, had served in the Navy all his life, was respected, but it was decided to lay the blame on him. In November 1945, he was summoned to a military tribunal. The official charges read as follows: failure to take necessary measures to prevent a submarine attack, that is, not zigzagging. Failure to give the order abandon ship in time. The accusation looked questionable from the very beginning. There was no official order obliging him to zigzag. At night and in calm weather, the captain had the right to go on a straight course. That was not considered a violation. Moreover, many ships in the same waters went exactly the same way. But the Navy needed to show that it controlled the situation and did not lose ships through organizational negligence. At the trial, McVeigh behaved calmly. He did not deny that he had sailed on a straight course, but explained, visibility had been poor, and the zigzag maneuver at night only increased the risk of collision with his own waves and debris. Even if he had changed course, the submarine could easily have corrected its aim. The distance had been too short. The most astonishing episode occurred when the captain of the Japanese submarine, Motedzura Hashimoto, who had sunk the Indianapolis, was summoned to testify. It was a precedent. A Japanese officer for the first time appeared as a witness at an American military trial. Hashimoto spoke honestly and without trying to justify himself. He confirmed that even if the Indianapolis had been zigzagging, the outcome would have been the same. The torpedoes had been fired from minimal distance, and it had been impossible to miss. Despite this testimony, the tribunal found McVeigh partially guilty. He was sentenced to disciplinary punishment and removed from duty. He was not sent to prison, but his career was over. For an officer of his rank, it was effectively a catastrophe. After the trial, the captain returned home. He gave no interviews and avoided publicity. The years passed, but peace never came. Relatives of the dead sailors wrote him letters, blaming him for the deaths of their sons and husbands. Every year he received dozens of such messages. People wanted to know why their loved ones had died. Many simply needed someone to
McVeigh endured the catastrophe with deep pain. He carried the burden of responsibility for his crew, even though he had not broken a single order. Officers who had served under him defended his actions, but public opinion remained merciless. In November 1968, 23 years after the tragedy, Charles McVeigh's life came to a tragic end at his home in Florida. In his hands he held a small toy sailor, a gift from his son, a quiet symbol of everything he had lost. Yet, even after his death, the story was far from over. A new struggle began, the fight to restore his honor. Survivors of the USS Indianapolis who had drifted for days in the ocean decided to prove that their captain had been wrongly accused. They wrote to Congress, to newspapers, gathered signatures. Historians and Navy veterans joined their cause. A turning point came in the late 1990s when a Florida schoolboy named Hunter Scott chose the Indianapolis tragedy for his school project. He studied official records, court transcripts, and presented the story of Captain McVeigh's unjust blame. His work gained attention. Survivors, journalists, and lawmakers began to talk about it again. The boy's research reached Congress. Veterans invited him to testify at hearings. In 2000, after decades of effort, the United States Congress officially cleared Captain McVeigh of all charges. The Navy acknowledged that he had acted properly, and that the true causes of the disaster lay in communication failures and organizational mistakes. This recognition came too late for McVeigh himself, but for the sailors of the Indianapolis, it became a matter of honor. They succeeded in restoring their captain's name to the roll of Navy heroes. After that, the ship's story returned to the public eye. Documentaries and books appeared, including In Harm's Way by Doug Stanton, 2001, which tells in detail about the voyage, the secret mission, the catastrophe, and the 4 days of horror endured by the survivors. The tragedy of the Indianapolis even entered popular culture. In the 1975 film Jaws, one of the characters recalls surviving the sinking of the cruiser, a scene through which millions first learned about this forgotten chapter of wartime history. But beyond cinema, the tragedy of the Indianapolis remained above all a symbol of human endurance and bureaucratic error. The people who survived 4 days in the hell of the ocean continued together for the rest of their lives. They met every year, supported the families of the dead, and spoke in schools, telling young people that behind every military feat stand real people, not names from textbooks, but living destinies. After the trial and the death of Captain McVeigh, the topic of the Indianapolis disappeared from newspapers and news for several decades. For the US Navy, it was a painful story they tried not to recall. In reports it was mentioned only in dry lines: ship sunk, crew partially rescued. But for the surviving sailors this tragedy never ended. Most of them returned home with severe physical and psychological trauma. They had lived through 4 days of hell, lost friends, and seen death every hour. Many could not sleep without nightmares. Some developed post-traumatic stress, which at that time could not yet be treated. People awoke at night from the sound of water or the smell of fish. Some could not look at the ocean for the rest of their lives. Nevertheless, gradually, the former sailors began to seek one another out. In the 1960s, several survivors created the organization Survivors of USS Indianapolis, a community of the rescued. They corresponded, met, shared memories. Their main goal was not to let the story die. They wrote letters to archives, to the Navy, demanded a review of the captain's case, and sought publication of all documents related to the catastrophe. At that time, the public knew little about these events. Everything changed after the release of Jaws in 1975. In one of the film's most powerful scenes, the character named Quint tells how his ship was sunk and his comrades were killed by sharks. It was a fictional character, But the basis was the real story of the Indianapolis. For millions of viewers around the world, it was their first acquaintance with this tragedy. After the film, interest in the story flared up again. Newspapers began to write articles. Historians searched for documents. The first documentaries appeared. Journalists interviewed survivors and published their letters. Americans learned that behind the beautiful words heroism and war often hide mistakes that cost hundreds of lives. In the 1990s, the veterans of the Indianapolis achieved the construction of a memorial in their home state, Indiana. In the center of the city of Indianapolis, a granite wall was erected with the engraved names of all the crew members, both those who died and those who survived. Every year on July 30, families, school children, and sailors come here. They light candles, read the names, and cast wreaths into the water. By that time, there were fewer and fewer living witnesses of the tragedy. People aged, grew ill, and passed away one after another. But until their last days they continued to gather. Their meetings always followed the same pattern: a minute of silence, photos of the dead, reading of Captain McVeigh's letters and his rehabilitation. At the same time, research work continued. Historians reconstructed the ship's route, compared Japanese and American documents, analyzed radio networks. More and more data confirmed that the captain could not have prevented the attack. Many believed that he had become a victim of the system, of bureaucracy, and fear of losing face before the public. For the Navy, this story became a serious lesson. After the tragedy of the Indianapolis, new rules appeared in American naval practice. Every ship is obliged to transmit its coordinates daily. If communication is lost for more than 24 hours, an alarm is automatically declared. Every distress signal is checked independently of other sources. The accounting system includes duplicate lines of control so that no ship will ever disappear at sea without a trace again. These measures saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives in the following years, in Korea, in Vietnam, and in other conflicts. The Indianapolis became an example of how the mistakes of one time become experience for the next generation. In the 2000s, searches for the ship itself began. The site of its sinking had long remained unknown. Researchers relied on the records of Japanese Captain Hashimoto, testimonies of survivors, and ocean currents. But the area where the ship could lie exceeded the size of an entire country. Dozens of expeditions tried unsuccessfully to find traces. Only in August 2017 did the search succeed. A private expedition financed by Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft. The footage spread around the world. For the survivors and their families, it became the moment when history came full circle. The ship was found. The site of its death became an underwater memorial. The US Navy officially recognized this site as a military burial ground and forbade any attempt to raise the remains. Now, every year virtual expeditions are sent there. Scientists monitor the condition of the wreckage and create 3D models to preserve the memory of the ship in digital form. By the 2020s, fewer than a dozen of the 316 survivors remained alive. The last participants of the tragedy lived out their years receiving letters and thanks from those who had learned their story. Many said they finally felt peace because the truth had triumphed. Today, the USS Indianapolis is not just the name of a ship. It is a symbol of human endurance, the horror of war, and the mistakes that must never be repeated. In US naval academies, this story is studied as an example that even a powerful army can lose because of poor organization and underestimation of danger. This tragedy forever changed attitudes toward rescue operations, communication, and the responsibility of commanders. In every US textbook on maritime safety, there is a chapter called the Indianapolis Lesson. The story of the cruiser is also remembered as part of the global picture of the end of the war. It delivered the components of the weapon that changed the world and perished itself, not surviving only a few weeks before peace. Thus, the ship became a symbol of an era, the very boundary between World War II and the beginning of the atomic age.